What if I told you the Pentateuch isn't hanging by isolated verses? It's hanging by structural beams buried in the dirt of the ancient world? Not one artifact, not one inscription, not one lucky discovery, but an interlocking anchor system that stretches from the Nile Delta through Transjordan into Iron Age Judah and into covenant treaty tablets written centuries before Rome ever existed. Most debates about the first 5 books of the Bible are shallow. Where's the smoking gun? Where's Moses' signature? Where's the Exodus monument? But that's the wrong question. Ancient history doesn't collapse or stand on single bullets. It stands on structural convergence. And when you map the anchors properly, not by book, but by civilization layer, something unsettling happens. Genesis locks into Egyptian population realities. Exodus locks into Delta urbanism. Numbers locks into a prophet named Balaam outside the Bible. Leviticus locks into a real altar residue. Deuteronomy locks into Bronze Age treaty architecture. And none of these anchors sit alone. They crossbind. They overlap. They create tension. Remove one book and you don't get a neat collapse. You get structural stress across the entire system. Tonight, we're not looking to do Sunday school archaeology. We're mapping the Pentateuch Anchor Matrix, the upper interlocking structure that forces the conversation out of slogans and into systems. If you've ever wondered whether the first 5 books float in myth, or whether they're embedded in the late Bronze and Iron Age world more deeply than critics would like to admit, then stay with me. Because once you see how the beams connect, you can't unsee it. So let's start where Genesis ends, Egypt. We know now from excavations at Tel el Dab'a that the eastern Nile Delta housed large Semitic populations in the 2nd millennium BCE. Not hypothetical populations, excavated settlements, burials, material culture. Administrative lists like the Brooklyn Papyrus name dozens of Asiatics and Egyptian households. This is not speculation, it's documentation. Now move forward. Exodus opens in the Delta. Archaeology confirms the existence of Pi-Ramesses, a Ramesside capital in the exact region associated with the biblical toponym Ramses. That city is real, mapped, excavated. Then something happens. Israel appears in Canaan. And by 1208 BCE, the Merneptah Stele names Israel in the land. That inscription exists. It is in stone. This is a corridor. Genesis ends in Egypt. Exodus begins in Egypt. Numbers moves toward Transjordan, and Israel is in Canaan by the late 13th century BCE. That's one beam, and it stretches across 3 books. The priestly system. Now let's shift systems. Exodus establishes a tabernacle. Leviticus regulates sacrifice. Numbers preserves the priestly blessing. Deuteronomy centralizes worship. Do we find evidence of such a system? Yes. At Tel Arad, excavators uncovered a Judahite shrine with incense altars. Recent residue analysis confirmed actual incense burned there. At Beersheba, a dismantled horned altar was discovered, matching the architectural type described in sacrificial texts. And then there's Ketef Hinnom. 2 small silver amulets, 7th century BCE, engraved with the priestly blessing from Numbers 6. Not medieval, not Persian era, pre-exilic. That means priestly liturgy was already circulating in written form before the Babylonian destruction. That's not a vague parallel. That's text on metal. And it touches Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's the second beam. The covenant spine. Now the legal architecture. Deuteronomy isn't random law. It follows a recognizable treaty pattern. Preamble, historical prologue, stipulations, blessings and curses, witnesses, deposit clause. That structure matches late Bronze Age Hittite treaties. It parallels Neo-Assyrian vassal treaties. These aren't vague similarities. They're formal structural correspondence preserved in clay tablets. which means Deuteronomy's covenant form is embedded in real ancient political architecture. Exodus 20 through 24 establishes covenant. Deuteronomy renews it. That's not literary improvisation. That's structural continuity. That's a beam number 3. The named anchor. Now something rare. A name. At Deir Allah in Jordan, archaeologists uncovered an 8th century BCE inscription referencing Balaam, son of Beor. The same name that appears in Numbers 22 through 24, an extra-biblical prophetic tradition outside the Bible. That's not a coincidence, that's convergence. The interlock. Now step back. What do we actually have? A geopolitical beam, a cultic beam, a covenant beam, and a named individual anchor. And none of these belongs to only one book. They cross-bind. Remove Genesis and you destabilize the Egypt corridor. Remove Exodus and the cult system loses its origin narrative. Remove Leviticus and priestly regulation collapses. Remove Numbers and the priestly blessing and Balaam anchor disconnect. Remove Deuteronomy and the covenant architecture fractures. This is not 5 floating books. This is a structural lattice, the Pentateuch Anchor Matrix. Archaeology does not give us a single dramatic inscription that says everything happened exactly as written. What it gives us is something more powerful. Systems that match, systems that interlock, systems that span books, and systems that are excavated, cataloged, published, and studied. Here's the shift. If you demand a single artifact that proves every verse, you will miss the structure. But if you map the structure, you see embedding. Not in one place, in multiple independent systems, across geography, across centuries, across disciplines. The Pentateuch is not defended by one stone. It is anchored by converging beams. And when beams converge, the burden shifts. Not because archaeology proves theology, but because archaeology situates text inside the ancient world it describes. That is the matrix. That is the anchor structure. And that is what the dirt has revealed. The Pentateuch Anchor Matrix is an interlocking archaeological framework for the Torah. Abstract. This study proposes a structured model for evaluating archaeological evidence related to the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, termed the Pentateuch Anchor Matrix, or PAM. Rather than assessing each book independently or demanding singular proof text artifacts, the model identifies 3 interlocking tiers of archaeological anchors. 1. Civilizational geopolitical anchors, 2. Cultic priestly material anchors, and 3. Covenantal treaty structural anchors. When mapped across the 5 books, these anchors form a cross-binding system embedded within the Late Bronze and Iron Age Near Eastern world. The Pentateuch in this model is not sustained by isolated finds, but by overlapping structural convergences between text and material culture. 1. The limits of isolated proof. Archaeological discussions of the Pentateuch frequently operate under an evidentiary fallacy, the expectation of a singular inscription explicitly confirming Mosaic authorship or narratival events, e.g. an Exodus monument. However, ancient Near Eastern historiography rarely yields such individualized corroboration. Instead, textual traditions are elevated by their embeddedness within verifiable civilizational frameworks. Dever 2001, Kitchen 2003. The Pentateuch Anchor Matrix, or PAM, shifts the analytic lens from proof of event to structural convergence across systems. Tier 1. Civilizational geopolitical anchors. Genesis to Exodus to Numbers. These anchors situate the Pentateuch within the documented Egypt-Levant corridor of the 2nd millennium BCE. 1. Levantine populations in the Nile Delta. Excavations at Tel Edeba, ancient Avaris, demonstrate substantial West Semitic populations in the Eastern Delta during the Middle and Late Bronze Ages, Bitax 1996 and 2010. Material culture and burial practices confirm Levantine presence. Similarly, Papyrus Brooklyn 35.1446 of the 13th dynasty lists numerous servants with Semitic names designated as Asiatics. Hayes 1955, Redford 1992. This provides administrative documentation of Levantine individuals integrated into Egyptian households. These anchors bind Genesis' Egypt migration motif and Exodus opening demographic setting into a known population reality. 2. Pi-Ramesses and Delta toponymy. Archaeological identification of Pi-Ramesses at Quantir, Habachi 1954, Kitchen 2003, confirms the existence of a Ramesside capital in the Delta region traditionally associated with the Exodus toponym Ramses, Exodus 1 verse 11. 3. Israel in Canaan, late 13th century BCE. The Merneptah Stele, 1208 BCE, includes the earliest extra-biblical reference to Israel in Canaan, Hoffmeyer 1997, Hassel 1994. This inscription anchors the terminus antechem for Israel's presence in the southern Levant. 4. Shasu of Yah. Egyptian inscriptions from Soleb and Amara West reference Shasu of Yah, dated to the 14th to 13th centuries BCE. Astor 1979, Rainey 2008. While debated, these inscriptions attest to a Yah-rated toponym or group in the southern Transjordan Seir region, geographically proximate to Numbers wilderness itineraries. Interlock effect. These civilizational anchors create a continuous geopolitical corridor from Genesis' Egyptian setting through Exodus and into the Transjordan movements of Numbers. Tier 2. Cultic priestly material anchors. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The Pentateuch devotes significant space to sacrificial systems and priestly regulation. Material culture provides independent confirmation of such systems in Iron Age Israel and Judah. 1. Tel Arad Shrine. Excavations at Tel Arad uncovered an Iron Age Judahite shrine with incense altars. Aharoni 1968, Herzog 2002. Recent residue analysis identified frankincense and cannabis on the altars. Ari et al. 2020. This confirms active incense ritual consistent with Pentateuchal cult prescriptions. 2. Beersheba horned altar. A dismantled horn altar discovered at Beersheba 10th to 8th century BCE demonstrates altar architecture corresponding to biblical descriptions of horned altars. Aharoni 1974, Mazar 1990. 3. Ketef Hinnom silver amulets. The Ketef Hinnom amulets, 7th century BCE, contain a version of the priestly blessing from Numbers 6 verse 24 through 26. Barke et al. 2004. This pushes written Pentateuchal liturgical materials securely into the First Temple period. 4. Paleo-Hebrew Leviticus scroll, 11Q Paleo-Lev. The Dead Sea Scroll, 11Q Paleo-Lev, demonstrates Leviticus textual transmission in Paleo-Hebrew script during the late Second Temple period, Cross 1995, Tov 2012. Interlock effect. These cultic anchors demonstrate the operational reality of priestly systems that span Exodus tabernacle, Leviticus regulations, Numbers priestly blessing, and Deuteronomy centralization command. Tier 3. Covenant treaty structural anchors. Exodus to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy exhibits structural parallels to late Bronze Age suzerainty treaties, Mendenhall 1954, Kitchen 2003. Its formal components align with Hittite treaty structure. Preamble, historical prologue, stipulations, blessings and curses, witnesses, and deposit clause. Neo-Assyrian treaty texts, particularly the vassal treaties of Esarhaddon, SAA 2, demonstrate curse formula parallels with Deuteronomy 28, Parpola and Watanabe, 1988. These corpora establish that Deuteronomy's covenant form is deeply embedded within known ancient Near Eastern political legal architecture. Named individual anchor, Balaam. The Deir Allah inscription from 8th century BCE references Balaam, son of Beor, parallelizing Numbers 22 through 24. Hofjitzer and van der Kuij, 1976. This is one of the rare instances in which a named Pentateuchal figure appears in independent epigraphic tradition. The interlocking model. The Pentateuch Anchor Matrix demonstrates that civilizational anchors cross Genesis, Exodus, Numbers. Cultic anchors cross Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Treaty structure anchors bind Exodus and Deuteronomy. Named figure anchors intersect numbers with Transjordan tradition. The strength of the Pentateuchal archaeological profile lies not in isolated confirmation, but in overlapping structural convergence across tiers. So in conclusion, the Pentateuch Anchor Matrix reframes archaeological evaluation from linear book-by-book validation to multi-tiered structural integration. The Torah is embedded within a documented Egypt-Levant demographic corridor, a verifiable Iron Age cultic infrastructure, recognizable Late Bronze Iron Age covenantal treaty systems. This model does not claim exhaustive verification of narrative events. Rather, it demonstrates that the Pentateuch operates within and is cross-bound by archaeologically attested systems of civilization, ritual, and political law. The interlocking nature of these anchors creates cumulative evidentiary pressure. Removal of one textual layer produces tension across multiple tiers, indicating systemic embedding rather than isolated literary invention. Now I want to do something unusual. I want to do math. Not complicated math, just disciplined reasoning. So here's the question. If the Pentateuch were mostly a late literary construction, how likely is it that we would see multiple independent archaeological systems aligning across 5 books? So here's how we test that. I'm going to assign what I call an evidence multiplier to each major anchor beam. An evidence multiplier works like this. If a beam is neutral, meaning it doesn't favor either explanation, it gets a multiplier of 1. If a beam is more likely under real historical embedding than under late invention, it gets a number bigger than 1. The bigger the number, the stronger the push. And then we multiply the beams together. That's it. Let's go beam by beam. Beam number 1, the Egypt-Levant corridor. We have excavated Levantine populations in the Delta. We have Ramesside urban centers. We have Israel named in Canaan by the late 13th century. We have the Shasu of Yah lane in Egyptian records. Is that more expected if the Pentateuch is embedded in the late Bronze world? Or more expected if it's a late synthetic invention? Even conservatively, I'll say this beam gives us a multiplier of 3. Not 10, not 50, just 3. Beam number 2, the priestly and cultic system. We have horned altars. We have incense residues at Tel Arad. We have the priestly blessing engraved on silver in the 7th century BCE. We have Leviticus preserved in Paleo-Hebrew script. Again, is that neutral? Or does that fit more naturally with a historically embedded priestly tradition? Conservative, I'll give this beam another multiplier of 3. Beam number 3, the covenant architecture. Deuteronomy's structure aligns with known treaty forms preserved in clay tablets from the ancient Near East. This isn't vague similarity, this is formal architecture. Even if we stay cautious, I'll assign this beam a multiplier of 2. Beam number 4, a named individual. Balaam son of Beor appears in an 8th century BCE inscription outside the Bible. Named figures are rare, that matters. Conservatively, I'll assign that a multiplier of 2. Now let's multiply. 3 times 3 is 9. 9 times 2 is 18. 18 times 2 is 36. That means, under extremely conservative assumptions, the embedded historical explanation is 36 times stronger than the late synthetic explanation. 36 times. And remember, I intentionally chose small numbers. If any beam is stronger than I allowed, if the corridor beam is 5 instead of 3, the number jumps quickly. 5 times 5 times 3 times 2 equals 150. So depending on how conservative you are, the embedded explanation becomes dozens to over 100 times more plausible. Now here's the key point. I didn't multiply individual artifacts. I multiplied systems. That prevents exaggeration. And the systems cross-bind multiple books. This is not one lucky inscription. This is structural convergence. When multiple independent beams each push in the same direction, and when they overlap across 5 books, the scale moves. That's the math. Not mystical, not emotional, not rhetorical, just multiplication. So let's step back. We didn't chase miracles. We didn't chase headlines. We didn't chase a single dramatic inscription that says this book is true. We mapped systems. Genesis sits inside a real Egypt-Levant corridor that archaeology has uncovered. Exodus opens in a delta world that has been excavated. Leviticus regulates altars and incense have been found. Numbers preserves a priestly blessing, and that blessing was engraved in silver before the exile. Deuteronomy follows covenant architecture preserved in clay treaty tablets centuries before Rome. These are not isolated correspondences, they are beams. Geopolitical beams, cultic beams, covenantal beams. And when we multiply those beams together, even conservatively, the explanation that the Pentateuch is historically embedded becomes dozens of times stronger than the alternative. That's not rhetoric. That's multiplication. The power of the Pentateuch Anchor Matrix is not a single artifact. It's in the interlock. Multiple independent systems, multiple time periods, multiple excavations, multiple disciplines, all converging, not to prove every verse, but to anchor the structure. You can debate theology all you want to. You can debate interpretation, but you cannot pretend the first 5 books float in a vacuum. They sit inside a world archaeology has already uncovered, not proven by one stone, but stabilized by the weight of the system. That is the matrix, and that is the math, and that is the structure in the dirt.